I remember the smell of the hospital before I remember the feeling of exhaustion. It's a layered thing. Antiseptic and something organic beneath it. Something human. Sweat, maybe. Fear. The particular staleness that happens when an air system circulates the same recycled breath through corridors for 12 hours straight. I'd been breathing it since 7 that morning, and by the time I clocked out, it had settled into the fabric of my scrubs like a second skin. My hands were still damp when I walked through the front door of my parents' house. Not from washing, I always washed thoroughly, but from the latex gloves I'd stripped off in the break room. That particular sweat that happens when your hands have been confined in plastic for hours. I was already mentally mapping the evening. Shower. Check on Lily. Eat something that didn't come from the hospital cafeteria. Maybe sleep for more than 4 hours before my shift tomorrow. My mother's voice came from the dining room before I'd even set my bag down. "Emily, can you come in here for a minute?" The phrasing was wrong. Not mom's making dinner, or dad's asking about your shift. The formal structure of it, the gathering of sound behind a closed door, triggered something in my nervous system that I'd learned not to trust but couldn't quite ignore. I'd been living in their house for 2 years. Rent-free, they reminded me constantly, as though housing was a gift rather than something a parent provides to their child. And I'd come to recognize the syntax of ambush. I found them arranged in the dining room like a photograph they'd planned. My father, Thomas, sat at the head of the table. My mother, Rebecca, to his right. Between them, a neat stack of documents, the kind with official letterhead that made my chest tight. To the left sat my sister Lily in her wheelchair, positioned at an angle that made her appear thoughtful rather than trapped. She was looking out the window, her fingers arranged in her lap with practiced stillness. I was still in my scrubs. I hadn't showered. My hair was in the kind of bun that happens when you've been moving between patient rooms all day. Not a deliberate choice, but an accident of gravity and neglect. "Sit down," my father said. It wasn't cruel. That was almost worse. It was the way a doctor speaks when they're about to deliver news that requires a chair. I sat across from them, the table like a border between territories. "We need to talk about the future," my mother said. She had this quality, especially in formal moments, of sounding like she was reading from something prepared. About sustainability. About what happens to Lily if something happens to you. "I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded thin in that room. "You're 28, my father said. "You work long hours. You have no retirement savings to speak of. You have no spouse, no guarantee of stability." He slid one of the documents toward me. "We've had our attorney draw this up. It's a caregiver agreement and a financial responsibility covenant." I looked at the paper. The words moved in front of my eyes without entering my brain. Caregiver. Commitment. Fiduciary duty. Monthly stipend. Retirement account liquidation. "We need you to cash out your retirement account," my mother said. "The 401k from the hospital. We've calculated that with interest we can set up a trust for Lily's care that would guarantee." "I'm not cashing out my retirement," I said. The words felt small and stubborn. "It's already been spent," my mother said gently. "On Lily's therapy, on her wheelchair, on—" "What are you talking about? I've been paying Lily's expenses. I send you money every month." My father leaned forward. "That's what we need to formalize. You've been helping, Emily, but it's been ad hoc, emotional. We need legal structure. We need assurance that when we're gone, you'll continue to care for your sister as you've promised." The room had that peculiar acoustic quality where sound arrived a half second after speech, like I was watching myself in this scene rather than living it. I looked at Lily. She was still looking out the window. The afternoon light was hitting her face at an angle that made her look peaceful, or maybe just unreachable. "I promised when I was 17, I said quietly. "I promised I'd always take care of her." My mother's face shifted. Not into sympathy, but into what I can only describe as professional validation. Like I'd said the thing she'd been waiting for me to say. Like I'd confirmed something. "Yes," she said. "You did. And we're not asking you to break that promise. We're asking you to honor it in a way that survives us. To formalize it. I've already been formalizing it, I said. I'm sending money. I'm here 3 nights a week. I've organized her physical therapy schedule. But what about her future? My father interrupted, not unkindly. What about when you have children? When you want to travel? When you want a life of your own? The question hung there, and I realized it was a trap. Because if I said, I'll still take care of her, I was signing something I didn't understand. And if I said, I want a life of my own, I was admitting to the selfishness they'd spent my entire adult life teaching me to fear. You should know, my mother said, and her voice had taken on that particular texture it got when she was about to weaponize something, that people at your hospital have said they admire your sacrifice. Dr. Patterson specifically mentioned how dedicated you are to your family. That kind of reputation is precious, Emily. That kind of character is what builds a life that means something. I felt it then, that familiar weight settling across my shoulders. The weight I'd carried since I was 17 years old and had knelt by Lily's hospital bed and promised her I would never leave her alone. The weight that had become so much a part of my physical structure that I sometimes forgot it was there until someone reminded me. Sign the document, my father said. We can set up the liquidation process with your HR department. The sooner we get this in place, the sooner we can all breathe easier. I looked at the papers again. The words were clearer now, sharp and legal and absolute. Monthly payment commitments, behavioral clauses, provisions for what would happen if I tried to leave. They'd thought about me leaving. They'd written provisions for it. I need to think about it, I said. My mother's expression tightened, just slightly. We were hoping you'd understand the urgency. Urgency, I repeated. I was still in my hospital scrubs. Somewhere in my pocket was a pen I'd stolen from a supply cart, and it was still wet because I'd used it to document vitals an hour before I left. Reality felt very far away. We're not getting younger, my father said, and we need to know that Lily is going to be taken care of. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand. My body just extracted itself from the chair and moved toward the hallway. I need to shower, I said. I'll think about it. Behind me, I heard my mother say something to my father in a tone too low for me to quite catch. But I knew the shape of it. It was the tone of someone who had expected resistance, who had a plan for resistance. The shower was hot enough that it burned a little. I stood under it for a long time, letting the hospital smell wash away. And then I realized that what I wanted to wash away couldn't be accessed with water. It lived deeper than skin. I sat on the edge of the bathtub after, my hair still dripping, and called Claire. We'd met in college. She'd been pre-law, I'd been in nursing, and we'd somehow ended up as roommates sophomore year and just never separated. She was one of those people who had a trajectory from the very beginning. Sharp, ambitious, impossible to manipulate. I'd always envied that about her. The way she seemed to operate from some internal compass that couldn't be reoriented by guilt or obligation, or the careful architecture of other people's expectations. Hi, she said. You sound terrible. My parents are trying to make me liquidate my retirement account. There was a pause. Not a shocked pause. More like the pause of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed. Tell me everything. We met 3 days later at a coffee shop in Boulder, equidistant from my hospital in Fort Collins and her law office. She ordered an Americano. I ordered something with too much sugar in it, and we sat at a corner table that felt appropriately clandestine for what was happening. I've been thinking about something, Claire said, not bothering with preamble. You've never actually told me what happened with Lily, the accident itself. You've talked about the consequences, about your promise, about your guilt, but you've never told me what actually happened. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup. There's not much to tell. I was supposed to pick her up from school. I got stuck at work. I called, said I'd be late. She decided to do something stupid. She fell. She's been in the wheelchair ever since. Who told you that? My parents, the doctors, everyone who was around at the time. Have you ever seen the police report? The question landed like something physical. I tried to think backward, to excavate the days immediately after the accident, but they were obscured by shock and guilt and the particular fog that happened when your world reorganized itself in a single moment. I realized I couldn't actually remember where or how I'd learned the details. They'd just been there, in the architecture of my guilt, as foundational and unmovable as walls. "No," I said, "I haven't." Claire pulled out her phone and slid it across the table to me. The screen showed a police report scanned in PDF format. Official letterhead. Case number. Witness statements. "I called a friend who's with the Colorado State Police," she said. "The accident was in Westminster, on Morrison Road. That's 15 miles from where you went to high school. It's also 15 miles from where your sister supposedly was coming from." I was reading the report, but not understanding it. The words were moving through my eyes without creating meaning. Then a name stopped me. A name I didn't recognize attached to a statement about a motorcycle. A name I definitely didn't recognize attached to an account of the afternoon. "Lily was on a motorcycle," I said, "with a boy named Marcus Webb. According to the report, your parents knew about the relationship and had explicitly forbidden it. Lily skipped school that day. She met Marcus at a location they'd apparently planned in advance. The accident happened when Marcus took a turn too fast on a rural road. Your sister was thrown from the motorcycle and landed on concrete." I was reading the same section over and over. My eyes kept catching on phrases like non-negligent third party and youthful violation of parental guidance and injured party's own recklessness. "Where was I?" asked. "You were at work, at the hospital, where you were supposed to be." Claire leaned forward. "Emily, do you understand what I'm saying? You weren't there. You weren't responsible. You weren't even involved." I felt something shifting in my chest, not like understanding, but like the framework of understanding was being built, and I was too tired and too confused to resist it. "My parents told me that I was responsible," I said slowly. "They told me that I'd promised to pick her up, and I got stuck at work, and because I wasn't there, Lily..." I couldn't finish the sentence. "They lied," Claire said quietly. "Or more accurately, they told you a story that served them. They presented you with a version of events that made you responsible and your sister blameless, and then they built an entire emotional architecture on top of that lie." "Why would they do that?" "Reputation," Claire said. She pulled out a laptop. "Your sister was 14. She was dating someone they didn't approve of. She was skipping school. She was making what they perceived as bad choices. An accident that was her fault, or partly her fault, reflects on them as parents. But an accident that was someone else's fault, especially the fault of a sister who was supposed to be responsible, that actually makes them look good. It makes them sympathetic." I was trying to construct this reframing in my mind, but it kept collapsing under the weight of a decade of accepted guilt. "But then why the financial stuff? Why are they trying to make me cash out my retirement?" "Control," Claire said simply. "You were never going to leave if you believed you were morally responsible. But financial entanglement is a different kind of control. It makes sure you stay even after you stop believing." Over the next week, Claire pulled financial records. She contacted a private investigator. She did what lawyers do when they're good at their job and motivated by seeing someone hurt. She built a case. What emerged was an architecture of extraction so complete and so carefully constructed that I was almost impressed by it. My parents had been systematically depleting my earnings since I'd started working. Every month, a standing transfer to their account, justified by Lily's care, by the house mortgage, by medical expenses that, when actually itemized, turned out to be smaller than the amounts transferred. There were forged signatures on documents. There were church donations that had been routed back to their mortgage payments. There were conversations between my parents and their family law attorney discussing how to ensure my financial compliance. I found witnesses. A neighbor who'd overheard my mother in the driveway saying, "Emily will take care of it. She'll do whatever we need. She thinks it's her fault." A cousin who remembered the week after Lily's accident. My mother saying, "This is actually perfect. She feels so guilty she'll do anything." a former HR representative from my mother's workplace, who remembered my mother bragging about how I was basically bankrolling their retirement. The worst part, I think, is that discovering the truth didn't make me feel better. It didn't feel like revelation or vindication. It felt like I was disassembling something that had been holding me up, and I wasn't sure what would happen once it was gone. I moved out of my parents' house 3 weeks after that first meeting with Claire. I took my important documents, my medical equipment from my room, the few things that were actually mine. I didn't make it dramatic. I didn't have a confrontation. I just left. My mother called me 7 times the first day. My father sent an email about how disappointed he was. Then it escalated. A letter from their attorney arrived, threatening legal action regarding breach of filial duty. My workplace was contacted with accusations that I was misrepresenting my family situation to gain sympathy from colleagues. My father appeared at the hospital and created a scene in the emergency room, loud enough that security had to intervene, claiming that I'd stolen family property. None of it was true. All of it was familiar. I'd spent a decade learning how to accept accusations I didn't deserve, so the novelty wasn't in the accusations themselves, but in my new ability to recognize them as fabrication. My parents called a family meeting 2 months later. When I say called, I mean they invited every relative in a 100-mile radius, coordinated with my church's pastoral staff, and arranged for a family law attorney to be present. It was orchestrated with the kind of precision that only people with something to hide can manage. The meeting was held in the church's community room. I arrived with Claire. I didn't know anyone else would be there until I walked through the door and saw my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, various cousins I hadn't seen in years. I saw the pastoral team. I saw an attorney in an expensive suit standing next to my father. "Emily," my father said warmly, as though I'd been welcomed here rather than entrapped. "Thank you for coming." I didn't sit down. "We've asked everyone here," my mother began, "because this is a family matter, and we thought it deserved a family response. Emily has made the decision to abandon her sister, to break her promises, and to damage her own soul in pursuit of independence." "That's not accurate," I said. "You've refused to sign the caregiver agreement," my father continued, as though I hadn't spoken. "You've left this house. You've stopped providing financial support. You've allowed your sister to believe that she's somehow expendable." I looked at Lily. She was sitting in her wheelchair across the room, not looking at me. She was wearing the expression she'd perfected over the years, blank, untouchable, suffering silently. I realized in that moment that I had no idea if she actually felt that way, or if she was performing that feeling. "The facts," I said, "are that I've been financially exploited by this family for a decade, on the basis of a false narrative. I was told that I was responsible for an accident that had nothing to do with me. I was told that my guilt was moral fact. And I was manipulated into believing that my entire future should be sacrificed for a lie." My mother's face went very still. "I have documentation," I said. And Claire stepped forward and began distributing photocopied documents, the police report, financial records, transcripts of recorded conversations, affidavits from people who'd witnessed the construction of this lie. I watched my parents' faces change. My father's attorney started speaking to him urgently in a low voice. My mother looked like someone watching a building she'd constructed catch fire. But the moment I'd imagined, the moment where I expected to feel triumph or satisfaction, didn't come. Instead, I felt hollow. "Is it true?" I asked, directing the question at Lily. Not in anger, but in genuine confusion. "Did you know? Did you always know?" My sister looked at me for the first time that day. Her eyes were wet, and something in her face cracked open. "Yes," she said quietly, "I knew." "Why didn't you say anything?" "I was scared," she said, and her voice was so small that I had to lean forward to hear it. "I was 14 and disabled, and I didn't know how to survive if I was the bad guy too. Your parents made it easier if there was someone else who was wrong, and you were always so sure you were guilty. I didn't know how to tell you that you weren't." She was crying now, and I realized I'd never actually seen my sister cry before. Not in the decade since the accident. I'd seen her perform pain, saw her accommodate limitation, saw her accept accommodation. But I'd never seen her grieve. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I should have told you. I should have said something. I was just scared." I crossed the room and kneeled down in front of her wheelchair. I was still wearing my work clothes. I'd come straight from the hospital, and I was suddenly aware of how strange I must look, in scrubs, kneeling in front of my sister while our entire family watched. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it, but it was a forgiveness that came with something else, something harder. "But I also need us to understand that this doesn't go back to before. You can't unsay this. I can't unknow it." The legal process took months. My parents eventually withdrew their attorney and tried to negotiate a settlement where I would agree not to press charges in exchange for them, signing away their financial claims against me. I agreed to it, not because they deserved mercy, but because I didn't have the energy to wage war. I wanted to move forward, and moving forward meant not being tethered to courtrooms. The story got out, in the way these stories do. It was mentioned in a local news segment about financial elder abuse and family manipulation. There were therapists who wanted to use it as a case study. There was even a true crime podcaster who reached out asking if I'd be willing to tell my story in episode format. I declined everything. Not from shame, but from a need for privacy that I'd never before been allowed to claim. I helped Lily move into an independent living situation with proper support services. Not because I was obligated, but because I wanted to. Because Lily, the real Lily beneath the performance and the guilt and the weaponization, was my sister. And she deserved the chance to live the life she'd actually been given. Not the life our parents had told her she was condemned to. I advanced my career. I became a supervisor, and then a regional coordinator. I started speaking at hospitals about recognizing signs of family manipulation among staff members. It was quiet advocacy, not dramatic vindication, but it felt honest in a way that nothing had felt honest before. 6 months after the legal process concluded, I invited Lily to my apartment for dinner. I'd made something simple: pasta, salad, bread. Nothing that required performance or pretense. We sat at my small table by the window, and the late afternoon light came through the glass at an angle that made everything look like it was painted rather than real. "I've been thinking about something," Lily said. She was twirling pasta on her fork, not looking at me. "About how I want to be a counselor, for people with spinal injuries, people who are trying to figure out how to live their lives after trauma." "Yeah," I said, "you'd be good at that." "I'd be good at that," she echoed. And there was something in her voice like she was trying the idea on, seeing how it fit. Because I lived it. Because I know what it's like. And not just the injury part, but the whole thing. The way people construct narratives about who you should be. The way they make you believe things about yourself that aren't true. I watched her cut her pasta and eat it, and I realized that this conversation was happening in a way it never could have happened before. It was happening between two adults who had both been hurt, not between a responsible sister and the sister she was responsible for. It was happening in the absence of obligation or guilt, or the weight of a lie. "I'm really proud of you," I said, and I meant it in a way that was uncomplicated by anything except actual pride. She looked at me then and smiled. It was a real smile. Not the smile of someone performing, but the smile of someone who had decided to allow themselves to exist as themselves. "I'm proud of you too," she said. We finished eating. I washed the dishes while Lily dried them, and we talked about other things. Her new apartment, my terrible hospital cafeteria stories, a documentary she'd been watching, a book I'd been meaning to read. The conversation was light and specific and real in a way that suggested that maybe, over time, what we could build between us wasn't a reconstruction of what had been destroyed, but something entirely new. After she left, I stood at my window and watched the light change. The sun was dropping toward the mountains, and the sky was doing that particular thing it does in Colorado, turning from blue to a color that doesn't have a name. I was exhausted in a way that wasn't entirely physical. There was an emotional exhaustion that came from finally putting down something I'd been carrying for so long that I'd forgotten it was a burden. But beneath that exhaustion was something else. Something like breathing. Something like the feeling of a weight being lifted not because it had been solved or reconciled or defeated, but simply because I'd decided to put it down. I thought about all the promises I'd made as a teenager, made in the heat of trauma and fear and love. I thought about how I'd kept those promises in the way I understood them, and how I'd discovered that the promises themselves had been constructed on a foundation of lies. I thought about how breaking those promises turned out to be the only way to actually become the person my sister needed me to be. The evening deepened into night. I turned on the lights in my apartment. I poured myself a glass of water. I let the day fall away from me, piece by piece, until what remained was just this moment and this breath and the absolute, uncomplicated relief of knowing that I was finally allowed to carry nothing but myself.